There is a dangerous lie that modern societies tell themselves. The lie is this: the worst political crimes only come from obviously evil people. The tyrants are easy to spot. That monsters announce themselves. That mass death begins with cruelty, not compassion. History says otherwise. The most dangerous leaders of the modern era didn't begin as villains. They began as moralists. They spoke the language of justice. They promised fairness. They framed themselves as healers of historic wrongs. And today, in New York City, we are watching that same moral pattern reemerge. Not with guns, not with prisons, but with ideas. Ideas advanced by Zohran Mamdani. Let me be clear, because clarity is important. This episode is not an accusation of intent. It's a warning about ideology. Because history doesn't punish intentions. It punishes belief systems that deny human natures, deny incentives, and concentrate power in the hands of those who believe that they are morally superior. And when we look honestly at modern history, not selectively, not emotionally, one figure stands as the clearest example of where this road leads. And that figure is Pol Pot. Not because Mamdani is Pol Pot, but because the logic behind their politics follows the very same deadly arc. Listen, this one idea has killed more human beings than any weapon in history. Not racism, not nationalism, not even religious extremism. The most lethal idea ever devised is this: that society can be rebuilt from scratch, and that people who resist that rebuild are obstacles, not citizens. We saw this in Jonestown, didn't we? Because the idea always begins gently. It begins with words like decommodify, abolish, reset, transform, reimagine. Words that sound clean, words that imply intelligence, and words that mask destruction. Mamdani's worldview rests on a core assumption that existing systems, markets, private ownership, profit, hierarchy are not flawed, but morally illegitimate. And that distinction is very important, because if a system is flawed, you reform it, you fix it. If it is illegitimate, you have to destroy it. And that's the fork in the road where every mass tragedy begins. If a system is flawed, you reform it. If a system is illegitimate, you destroy it. Because once something is declared illegitimate, the people who depend on it, work within it, succeed under it, become suspect. Not wrong, not mistaken, but immoral. And immoral people, history tells us, are not debated with. They are simply removed. Pol Pot didn't begin with killing fields. He began with theories. He believed, and look this up, he believed Cambodia could be purified. That inequality came from markets, and that cities were corrupt. and that education created a hierarchy, and that any ownership produced exploitation. So that sounds radical? Oh, yeah, sure it does. But does it sound unfamiliar? Not at all. The Khmer Rouge didn't argue that farmers were evil. They argued that urban life was immoral. The doctors weren't executed because they harmed people. They were executed because knowledge created inequality. Teachers weren't killed for their crimes. They were killed because education implied hierarchy. Right? The regime didn't need proof of wrongdoing. They only needed classification. So once you classify people as exploiters, hoarders, profiteers, beneficiaries of injustice, you no longer need evidence. You only need enforcement. This is the step that modern activists refuse to talk about. Because every economic vision requires an enforcement mechanism. You don't decommodify housing without force. You don't abolish profit without coercion. And you don't eliminate markets without punishment. Pol Pot didn't invent violence. He inherited it from the logic of his ideology. So when critics raise these concerns, defenders rush to a familiar phrase, but he's a democratic socialist, as if democracy is a safety net against tyranny. History laughs at that idea. Democracy is not a break. It's a gate. And once through that gate, power behaves exactly the same way it always has. Every authoritarian regime of the 20th century relied on popular support. Well, at first. What changes is not the process. What changes is the definition of legitimacy. Once a movement declares that markets are immoral, once a movement declares that success is unjust, once a movement declares that dissent protects oppression, then the opposition becomes unethical by definition. And when the opposition is unethical, suppressing it becomes virtuous. That is the moral inversion that precedes every single crackdown. Mamdani's rhetoric treats disagreement not as difference, but as corruption. That's not politics, my friends. That's purification. And here's the most uncomfortable truth of all. Every mass killing ideology believed it was helping humanity. Every mass killing ideology believed it was helping humanity. Tyrants never say, I want to destroy society. Here's what they say. They say things like, this will be painful, but necessary. Resistance proves guilt. The suffering is only going to be temporary. Future generations will thank us. The more confident someone is in their moral vision, the less restraint they have. And this is why conservatives are supposed to be talking about limits, while radicals talk about the ends. Mamdani talks endlessly about outcomes, but he talks very little about constraints. And the system without constraints don't fail gently. They collapse violently. Now, New York City is not abstract. We're not making it up. It's already fragile. It's got a shrinking tax base. It's got capital flight. People are running out of that place with their money because businesses are closing. Crime is rising. There's stress on the budget. And a radical ideology doesn't stabilize fragile systems. It basically accelerates their failure. And when those failures happen, the response is never reflection. They never think, well, maybe we were wrong. Maybe, maybe we should have. No, it's always escalation because they don't feel like they've done enough. That more needs to be done. Price controls become stricter, penalties become harsher, blame becomes louder. And folks, the targets are always the same. It's the landlords, the business owners, the professionals, the wrong people. And that's how utopias turn punitive, not because of hatred, but because of certainty. Let's circle back to this. With this truth, not comfort. Zohran Mamdani does not need to be evil to be dangerous. He only needs to believe that society is fundamentally unjust. He only needs to believe that markets are morally wrong. He only needs to believe that success is suspect and that dissent is harmful. Those beliefs have killed more people than bombs. And not because people wanted violence, but because they believed that they were justified. Friends, history is not subtle about this. It's screaming. And every time we ignore it, we pay again. In freedom first, and in lives eventually. New York deserves better than ideology dressed up as compassion. And America deserves leaders who understand that the most dangerous sentence in politics is this: we'll rebuild everything once we get rid of the old system. Because we've seen this before. And folks, it never ends the way they promise. Ever ends the way they promise. Here's a question that the radical movements never like to answer directly. It's a simple question. It's not emotional, not rhetorical, it's practical. Who enforces this? Every time you hear phrases like decommodify housing, abolish profit, guarantee outcomes, reimagine the police, is there's an enforcement structure hiding just off stage, because policies do not enforce themselves. For instance, if housing is no longer a commodity, then somebody decides the prices. Somebody decides access. Somebody decides who is hoarding, who has too many, has too much. Somebody makes that decision. And somebody decides who's complying. And that somebody is the state. And once the state decides winners and losers, we've seen this before, it must also decide punishments. And that's where this whole fantasy collapses. Because when people opt out, when they move capital, when they stop building, when they stop investing, when they leave, the ideology doesn't self-correct. Doesn't go, oh, well, maybe we got to chill out. People are leaving. Maybe we'll just back off. No, it tightens. It develops more rules, more penalties, more inspections, more accusations. And this is not theoretical. This is observable history. And it always produces the same outcome: the creation of a permanent enforcement class who are not public servants, not neutral administrators. They are ideological enforcers. That's when politics stops being about persuasion and starts being about compliance. Now, here's another reality check. History delivers us without mercy. Radical egalitarian systems don't fail because they're sabotage. They fail because they consume their base. At first, the targets are easy. The rich, we'll get the rich. We'll get the landlords. Then we'll get the corporations, right? Tax the rich, right? Landlords, corporations, what's that? Occupy Wall Street, remember? But once these sources are drained or they leave, And the difference in New York is that these people can just leave. They can just shut the business down and walk out. You know, get on an American airline, and in 2.5 hours, they're in Miami. Please don't come to Miami. Um, but they can. The system doesn't shut down. It expands its definition of guilt. It starts saying things like middle class professionals become privileged. And who are middle class professionals? I'll tell you, teachers, firefighters. Those are middle class professionals, right? Small business owners. Who are small business owners? People who run your Starbucks or your Chick-fil-A's or your restaurant or your dry cleaners, small businesses. Skilled labor becomes inequitable because that person can do something with their hands other people can't do. The net widens. And this is why radical systems always eat inward. Not because the leaders are cruel, but because the math stops working. And when the math fails, ideology does not retreat. It demands sacrifice, always from others and never from itself. Another pattern history teaches us is this: radical systems require permanent emergency to survive. There must always be a crisis. Are we seeing that? Are we seeing that now? An enemy, a justification, because emergencies excuse shortcuts. Emergencies or crises suspend norms. And an emergency centralize power. If the crisis ends, then the authority weakens. So the crisis never ends. Housing is always a crisis. Racism, always a crisis. Inequality, always a crisis. Justice is always unfinished. This keeps citizens anxious and compliant. It also explains why these movements are never satisfied. Victory would require restraint, and restraint undermines moral superiority. So the goalposts move forever. All right. Let me downshift here a little bit because this is important. I want you to get this. You do not need firing squads to lose a society. You only need moral certainty without limits, power without restraint, ideology without humanity. Zohran Mamdani represents a worldview that has never survived contact with reality without turning coercive. Not once. Not anywhere. Not ever. Now, that in itself doesn't make him a villain. It makes his ideas dangerous, however. And the most tragic words in political history are always the same. This time it'll be different. And it never is. Friends, history is not a scare tactic. It's a ledger. And every time a society decides that outcomes matter more than constraints, the bill comes due. First in freedom, then in prosperity, and eventually in lives. New York does not need a moral crusade. It needs leaders who understand limits, who understand trade-offs, and who understand human nature. Because again, utopias don't fall quietly. They fall loudly, they fall angrily, they fall violently. And they always fail at someone else's expense. We've seen this before. And ignoring that fact has never made the ending better. My name is Willie Lawson, and welcome to the Morning Report. Morning Report is production of FightBackMedia.com, 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 and FightBack Media TV. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, take care of yourself. We'll see you when we see you. Bye bye now.